The dress weighed more than a wedding dress should. I don't mean the fabric. The gown itself was probably 5 pounds. Ivory silk charmeuse, hand-sewn French lace along the neckline, a cathedral train that had been custom cut to trail exactly 18 inches behind me. I know those details because I'd memorized them during 3 fittings and 4 months of anticipation. But carrying it across the sidewalk toward Atelier Crane that Tuesday morning, the whole thing felt like it was made of wet concrete, like grief had soaked into every fiber. I'd wrapped it in the garment bag they'd given me, the long ivory one with the Crane logo, an elegant bird stitched in silver thread on the outer pocket. I held the bag against my chest with both arms, the way you'd carry a sleeping child, which is exactly what made it worse. I wasn't cradling something precious. I was hauling something I never wanted to see again. The street outside the boutique was quiet. Downtown had that particular Tuesday emptiness. Just pigeons and a coffee cart, and a woman walking a dog the size of a throw pillow. The Atelier Crane building was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed before you even touched the door handle. White marble facade, brass fittings, a single white rose arrangement in the window display that must have been refreshed every single morning. The sign above the entrance said only Crane in slim gold letters, because establishments like this one don't need to explain themselves. I pushed inside. The bell above the door was so soft it was practically an apology. The interior smelled of something I could never quite name, not perfume exactly, more like the idea of cleanliness and expense, with a faint undercurrent of roses and cedar. Everything was pale, the carpet, the walls, the velvet drapes, the silk-draped mannequins arranged like a congregation of patient ghosts. Soft light came from somewhere overhead, warm and even. The kind of light that was probably very flattering if you were here for the right reasons. I was not here for the right reasons. A young woman in a dark blazer appeared from behind a curtained archway. She had the kind of serene, professionally blank expression I associated with people paid to remain unruffled. "Welcome to Atelier Crane. Do you have an appointment?" "I need to return this," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I'd expected. "I purchased this gown 4 months ago. Custom order. It was never worn. I need to return it." The serene expression flickered only slightly. "Of course. Can I take your name?" "Mara Ellison." She tapped something into a slim tablet. A pause. Another tap. The flicker again. Less controlled this time. "Ms. Ellison, I see the order here. This was a full custom commission, with alterations completed 6 weeks ago. I'm afraid our policy on custom gowns is that they're non-refundable," I finished. "I know. I read the contract. But there were special circumstances, and I was told when I placed the order that if the event was canceled, the policy does include a clause for event cancellation," she said carefully. "But the return must be initiated within 30 days of cancellation, and the garment must be in unworn, unaltered condition. I'll need to verify both." She was being very professional, very measured. That was almost worse than if she'd just been rude, because professionalism forced me to match it, and I was not certain I could hold myself together long enough to be professional. Julian had told me he wasn't coming to the wedding 11 days ago. 11 days ago, I had sat in my bathroom on the cold tile floor in my bathrobe and cried until my vision went blurry. 11 days ago, I had called Rhea at 2 in the morning and listened to her say terrible, accurate things about Julian Mercer that I'd filed away for the precise moment when I could laugh at them. I wasn't laughing yet. "Unworn," I confirmed. "Never worn. The alterations are, the hem was let out and the bust was taken in slightly, but it's been returned to the original measurements. I had a seamstress reverse them. I'd paid more to have that done than I had for the dress itself, which was already more than I'd ever spent on anything in my life. I'll need to verify that with our head fitter before I can process anything. This may take a few minutes." She said it like the minutes would be painless. "If you'd like to have a seat, I'll stand." There were chairs near the window, pale velvet armchairs arranged around a low marble table with a vase of those white roses. I could not sit in one of those chairs. Sitting would mean settling in, and settling in would mean my brain would start doing what it had been doing for 11 days, which was replaying every conversation with Julian, in search of the exact moment I should have known. I stood near the curtained archway with the dress against my chest, and tried to look at the floor. The marble was beautiful. It was the kind of marble that made you think someone had spent a very long time choosing it. Pale gray veins on white ground, like frozen rivers. I focused on a particular vein near the toe of my left boot and tried to breathe. 2 more staff members appeared and disappeared through the archway, both looking at me with expressions calibrated somewhere between sympathy and professional distance. I heard murmuring behind the curtain. I heard the words custom order and policy, and something else I couldn't quite catch. Time passed. I'm not sure how much. The store was very quiet. A phone rang somewhere and was answered on the first tone. Outside, through the window, I watched the dog walker from before cross back in the other direction. The dog was trotting now, purposeful, having clearly accomplished everything it set out to accomplish. I envied the dog. Then the murmuring behind the curtain stopped. A different quality of silence settled over the boutique. I noticed it the same way you notice when a sound you'd stopped registering. A refrigerator hum, traffic noise, something constant, suddenly disappears. The staff member who had spoken to me first reappeared, and her expression had changed. She looked less professionally serene, and more like a person who had just been given specific instructions by someone whose instructions were not suggestions. "Ms. Ellison," she stepped to one side. "Miss Crane would like to speak with you." I didn't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't the woman who came through the curtained archway a moment later. She was tall, taller than me by several inches, though she wore heels that added to the effect. She moved the way expensive things move, with absolute certainty about where she was going, with no wasted motion, with a composure so complete it made the room rearrange itself around her. Her suit was charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, one of those garments that had clearly been made for her body and no other. Dark hair pulled back. No jewelry except small pearl earrings and a watch so understated it probably cost more than my car. Her eyes, when they landed on me, were a shade of blue-gray that reminded me of the marble floor. Cool, layered, unexpectedly beautiful. She didn't smile. She looked at me the way you'd look at a painting you were trying to understand. "Mara Ellison," she said, not a question. Her voice was quiet and very clear, the kind of voice that expected to be heard the first time. "Yes." Isolde Crane. She didn't extend her hand. She seemed to be waiting for something, but I couldn't tell what. Then her gaze dropped for just a fraction of a second, to the garment bag I was still holding against my chest, to the way my knuckles were white around the ivory zipper, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift you'd notice if you weren't watching carefully. But I was watching, because there was nothing else to look at. Her eyes returned to mine. "Celine," she said, without raising her voice, addressing the staff member behind her. "Leave the desk. Take everyone with you. Tell Marcella she can start her lunch break early." The woman, Celine, hesitated for half a heartbeat before she nodded and disappeared. I heard movement behind the curtain. The soft shuffle of people collecting their things. Then, nothing. Isolde Crane walked to the front door of the boutique, turned the lock with one smooth movement, and flipped the sign from open to closed. She did it without hurry, without ceremony, without any of the fuss I'd have expected from a decision that had to be costing her business something. Then she turned back to me. "No woman," she said quietly, "should have to fall apart under fluorescent lights." I opened my mouth to say I was not falling apart. I was fine, actually. Perfectly fine. Just a minor retail situation. And then I felt the tears start, and I realized that what I'd been calling fine for 11 days was simply the pressure behind a dam that was now, in this marble and white rose room, deciding it was finished. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. She didn't come to me immediately. She walked instead to a small console table near the wall, and I heard the soft clink of porcelain, and then she was beside me, not touching me, not trying to take the garment bag, simply holding out a tissue with the same calm precision she probably brought to everything. I took it. I pressed it against my eyes. My breath came out in 3 shuddering pieces. "Come," she said. I followed her through the curtained archway into the back of the boutique, a space I'd seen once during my fittings and had been too dazzled by the dress to look at closely. Now I noticed it properly. A large fitting room with 3 mirrors and a platform, a low velvet chaise longue along one wall, a tea service already waiting on a lacquered tray. There was a long rack of garments along the far wall, all of them covered in muslin, and the light back here was softer than the showroom, more like afternoon coming through gauze curtains. Isolde took the garment bag from my arms without asking permission. She hung it on the rack with practiced ease, then turned back to me. "Sit." I sat on the chaise. My legs were grateful. I pressed the tissue to my eyes again and tried to collect myself. Tea appeared in front of me. White porcelain cup, pale gold liquid, a faint smell of chamomile, and something slightly smoky. I hadn't even seen her pour it. "I'm sorry," I said, because I felt I should. "This is embarrassing. I don't normally do this." "You don't normally cry in boutiques?" "I don't normally cry in front of strangers." She settled into a chair across from me, crossed her legs, folded her hands in her lap, completely unhurried. "You've been crying alone for how long?" The question was so direct that it bypassed whatever defense I'd been preparing. 11 days. She nodded once, as though that number confirmed something she'd suspected. The wedding was scheduled for... I started again. We were supposed to get married 3 weeks from now. He told me it was over 11 days ago, in our kitchen, while I was making dinner. I heard how small that detail sounded when I said it aloud, the stupid particularity of it. Julian had stood in our kitchen while the pasta water came to a boil and told me that he didn't think we were right for each other, that he'd been feeling this way for a while, that he didn't want to hurt me. He used the phrase, growing apart. Isolde said nothing, but she was listening in a way that was different from how most people listen, without the small sounds of sympathy or the little flinches of discomfort, just absolute, uninterrupted attention. He moved out that night. He'd already organized it. He had a bag packed. I wrapped my hands around the teacup. The warmth helped. Ria, my best friend, she came over and we ate the pasta, and she said things about him that were extremely accurate and not suitable for mixed company, and I felt better for about 4 hours, and then I woke up the next morning and all the wedding gifts were still in our living room. Still in my living room, wrapped. I can't return them because most of them were addressed to both of us and I don't know what the protocol is. And every time I walk past them, I feel like a woman who believed in something that turned out not to exist. Anyway, I need to return the dress. Isolde was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much did the gown cost?" I told her. I watched her register the number without any change of expression. "And the reversal of alterations?" I told her that too. She was quiet again. She looked at me steadily, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being understood in ways I hadn't consented to. She was very still. Isolde Crane, I was beginning to realize, used stillness the way other people used words, to say things without saying them. "Tell me about the cancellation," she said finally. I did. I told her about the 4 months of gradually cooling conversations, the weekends Julian had said he was working, that turned out to have involved someone else's company. I told her about Nadine Vale, who had been my colleague at the school where I taught art. 2nd grade, 3rd grade, the ones who still believed drawing could do anything. Nadine had been at our engagement party. She had held my flowers in one of the photographs. I had liked her, which was perhaps the detail that hurt the most. I told Isolde about the people who'd asked me to be graceful about it. Julian's mother, who had called to say she was sorry, but also to explain that he'd been under tremendous pressure, and that I needed to consider his feelings. The mutual friends who wanted to remain neutral, which in practice meant they stayed close to Julian, and texted me occasionally to check in, as though my dignity were a minor inconvenience they were monitoring. My own mother, who had said, "These things happen, darling, and at least you're still young." I was 29 years old. I did not feel young. I felt like a woman who had spent 4 months choosing table centerpieces for a wedding that was going to happen to someone else. Isolde listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "He told you it was a matter of growing apart." That's what he said. He began this growing apart while you were selecting your wedding gown. When she framed it that way, it sounded even more specifically awful. apparently. And yet he allowed you to complete 4 months of wedding planning, spend a significant sum on a gown, accommodate alteration appointments, cancel the alterations to attempt a return, and arrive here alone. I looked at her. When you put it like that, it sounds like cowardice. She said it without heat, simply as a factual classification. He was afraid of the consequences of honesty, so he postponed them until you bore the expense of his delay. No one had said it quite that directly to me. Not Rhea, who'd been furious but perhaps slightly too protective to frame it as cleanly as that. Not my friends, who'd been gentle. Isolde Crane said it the way you'd say the weather, not to wound, simply because it was true. Something in my chest unknotted slightly, just slightly, the way a tight muscle feels after pressure is applied to exactly the right point. "Do you want the return?" she asked. "Or do you want something else?" "I want to not have the dress anymore." She considered this. Those are different things. Over the next hour, while afternoon light shifted on the gauze curtains, and I drank 2 cups of tea and ate a small shortbread biscuit that appeared from somewhere without my noticing, Isolde and I talked. Or rather, I talked and she listened, and occasionally she asked a question that peeled the conversation open in a direction I hadn't expected. She asked what I taught. She asked if I'd been making any art of my own since the cancellation. She asked what I had done with the wedding invitations. "I burned them," I admitted, "in my kitchen sink, which set off the smoke alarm." "Good," she said. She asked to see the dress. I unzipped the garment bag and held the gown up in the soft light of the fitting room, and we both looked at it for a moment. It really was beautiful. It had been beautiful from the moment I'd tried it on. The lace at the neckline was the kind of work that took someone a long time and a great deal of skill to produce. The silk fell in long, clean lines. It was an excellent dress. It just belonged to a life that was no longer mine. "I'm not going to process a refund," Isolde said. My stomach dropped, but "I'm going to offer you something else." She was looking at the dress, not at me. Her expression had changed slightly. It was still controlled, still composed, but there was something underneath it now, some current I couldn't name. "Leave it with me. Leave it. Don't make any decisions about it today. Leave it here and come back when you're ready. We'll discuss your options then." I didn't entirely understand what she was proposing, but I was very tired, and the tea had been warm, and being heard, really listened to, had taken something out of me the way release takes something out of you. A useful, exhausted kind of emptiness. I nodded. She walked me out through the showroom herself. She unlocked the front door. On the street outside, the afternoon had turned steel gray, the way autumn afternoons sometimes do in the middle of the week, and a fine cold rain had started while I'd been inside. I didn't have an umbrella. I'd been so focused on getting into the boutique and back out again as quickly as possible that the concept of weather hadn't occurred to me. Isolde Crane stepped outside, opened an umbrella I hadn't seen her carrying, and held it above my head while I found my car keys in my bag. She did not do this with any fanfare. She simply held the umbrella as though it were the obvious and only thing to do. "My car is just around the corner," I said. "Then I'll walk you around the corner." She did. She said very little on the walk, and neither did I. When I reached my car and unlocked it, I turned back to thank her, and she was looking at me with that same quiet, measuring attention she'd had in the boutique, like a painting she was still working out. "How do you take your coffee?" she asked. The question was so unexpected that I answered before I thought about it. "Black, 2 sugars." She nodded, as though adding that to a record she was keeping. Then she turned and walked back toward Atelier Crane with her umbrella, and I stood in the rain watching her go, which was ridiculous, but I couldn't seem to make myself get into the car until she'd gone inside. I drove home to my apartment full of unopened wedding gifts and sat at my kitchen table and called Rhea. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "Strange," I said. "Good strange, I think. Or at least, not terrible strange. The owner closed the boutique for me." Silence on the other end. She what? Closed it, locked the door, sent the staff to lunch early, made me tea. More silence, then. "Mara, tell me everything, leave nothing out. I have snacks and nowhere to be." I went back to Atelier Crane the following Thursday. Rhea had, predictably, asked me 13 follow-up questions about Isolde Crane, and then spent 20 minutes looking her up online, producing very little because Isolde appeared to have the digital footprint of a person who found the internet faintly vulgar. There was a website for the boutique, elegant, minimal, almost no photographs of Isolde herself, and a few mentions in luxury lifestyle publications. One profile described her as the most demanding bridal couturier in the city. Another called her the ice queen of bespoke fashion. Both said approximately the same thing, that Isolde Crane's clientele were intensely loyal, her waitlist was long, and she was personally charming in the way that very sharp things can be charming when the light catches them correctly. I found myself reading those profiles more carefully than was probably warranted. On Thursday, I arrived at Atelier Crane at the time Isolde's staff had suggested by a brief, formal email. The boutique was open. Céline greeted me with slightly less professional blankness than before, and showed me to the back fitting room, which had been rearranged, the chaise moved to a better angle, the wedding dress hanging on its own rack in the center of the room, spotlit in a way that made it look like an installation piece. I was looking at it when Isolde came in. She was wearing deep blue today, another perfectly fitted suit, and she'd brought coffee, 2 cups, from somewhere nearby, 1 black with 2 sugars. She handed it to me without comment, as though the coffee were simply part of the arrangement. "I've been thinking about the dress," she said. "Sit, please." I sat. She stood near the rack, looking at the gown with her arms folded loosely. In the better light, I could see that her expression, when she looked at it, was not what I'd expected. Not evaluative, not commercial. She was looking at it the way I look at a piece of student work that has something raw and interesting in it. Like she was seeing something in the construction that went beyond the sum of its parts. "I could resell it," she said finally. "It's the right quality, the right work. Someone would want it." That's probably sensible. But I don't think that's what should happen to it. She turned to look at me then, and the directness of her gaze still caught me slightly off guard, the way it had on Tuesday, like she'd removed several social filters that most people left in place. "I think it should become something else." "What do you mean?" She unfolded her arms, moved to the rack, and began working the silk between 2 fingers with the absolute lightness of someone who understood exactly how much pressure the fabric could bear. "This lace is irreplaceable. The charmeuse is a 20-year-old bolt from a French house that no longer exists. It should not sit on a rack with a new price tag. It should live. It should be worn again, in a different shape, by the person it was made for." She looked at me. "You." I shook my head before I'd fully processed what she was saying. "I can't afford. I'm not charging you for the work." The refusal was immediate and real. "I can't accept that. You're not accepting a gift." Her voice was measured, patient. "You're accepting a creative proposition. I want to see if this material can be honest about what it's been through." "That interests me professionally." She said the last part with a slight emphasis. Not defensive, just precise. "Let me show you something." She moved to a work table along one wall and spread out several pieces of paper, sketches, done in the clean, spare lines of someone who thinks visually. Not the wedding dress as it was. Something different. A bias-cut evening gown with an asymmetrical hem, the lace incorporated into the body of the piece rather than just the neckline, the cathedral train cut up and repurposed into something flowing and modern and entirely different. I looked at the sketches for a long moment. "This still looks like it cost a lot of money," I said. "It does cost a lot of money. I'm covering that." "Isolde Tyre? Think about it." She gathered the sketches without pressure. "You don't have to decide today." I thought about it for approximately 4 days, which included one very long phone call with Ria, who said, "Obviously yes. Are you actually insane?" with such conviction that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and one late night where I stood in my living room, surrounded by the unopened wedding gifts, and looked at them and thought about what it would mean to turn this particular piece of wreckage into something different. I called the boutique on Monday morning and said yes. What followed was 2 weeks of late evenings at Atelier Crane, because Isolde did all her most intensive work after closing time, when the showroom was quiet and the phones were off. I hadn't expected to be present for the construction of the new gown. I'd thought perhaps I'd come in for a few fittings and that would be that. But Isolde asked me to come, and I came, and I discovered that watching someone work fabric at a professional level was one of the most absorbing things I'd ever witnessed. She worked with an economy of motion that seemed impossible, given how complex the manipulations were. Her hands, long-fingered, bare of rings, precise, moved through the silk as though the fabric were telling her where to go. She'd explain, occasionally, what she was doing, in a voice that was lower in the evening, quieter, as though the late hour had taken some of the formality out of it. "The bias cut changes how gravity works," she said one evening, pinning a long seam with the speed of long practice. "A structural cut fights the body. This cut follows it. The garment becomes honest." I was sitting on the chaise with my shoes off, something that had happened gradually over the course of the first week, and that neither of us had commented on. I had a sketchbook in my lap. I'd started bringing it without quite planning to, the same instinct that made me carry one to school, and I'd been drawing her hands. "Can I ask you something?" She didn't look up from the seam. "You can ask." "Why?" "Honest. You used that word when you first described this. What does it mean for a dress to be honest?" A pause. Her hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed. "A dress built for an event that doesn't happen lies," she said finally. "It claims something that isn't true. The lie is in the design, in the hope it encoded that turned out to be a fiction." She smoothed the seam flat. "To make it honest is to change what it's saying, to let it say something about what actually occurred and what survived." I looked down at my sketchbook. I'd drawn her hands twice, from different angles, without entirely realizing I was doing it. I turned the page before she looked over. "I like the way you explain things," I said. She glanced up then, briefly. Something in her expression shifted, the way it had that first day, that small, private movement beneath the composure. Then she looked back at the silk. "Go home, Mara, it's late." "I'm not sleepy." "I know. Go home anyway." I went home, but I didn't sleep particularly well. The evenings accumulated. Wednesday, then Friday, then Monday again, then Thursday. Rhea started texting me questions like, "What did she wear tonight?" and "Did she say anything mysterious?" And I stopped answering with full responses, and started just sending the shrug emoji, because I didn't know how to describe what was happening in a way that would satisfy Rhea's very specific appetite for romantic detail, when I wasn't certain myself what was happening. What I knew, I looked forward to those evenings in a way that felt disproportionate to the stated purpose. I knew the smell of the back of the boutique now, the cedar and silk and the particular machine oil Isolde used on her sewing equipment. I knew she drank her tea too hot, and that she had strong opinions about the difference between ivory and ecru that I now shared. I knew she laughed rarely, but when she did, it was sudden and real, and slightly startled, like she forgot it was something she could do. One Friday night, I fell asleep on the chaise. I hadn't meant to. The hour was late and the room was warm, and the sound of the sewing machine had a particular rhythm. And I woke to find that the boutique was very quiet, and the lights had been dimmed, and there was a lightweight cashmere coat draped over me. Isolde was at the workbench, not sewing, just sitting with a cup of tea, reading something. She looked up when I stirred. "You have a class at 8, she said. "I know." I sat up slowly, the coat sliding from my shoulder. How long was I asleep? 40 minutes. The lace insert is almost finished. I looked at the gown on the rack. Even in the dimmed light, I could see the new shape emerging, the lines of it clean and strange, and somehow more true than what it had started as. 40 minutes of sleep on a velvet chaise in a locked boutique, while a woman I had known for less than 3 weeks sewed my wedding dress into something new. "Can I ask you something else?" "Apparently that's what we do at this hour." "What made you close the boutique that first day?" "You didn't know me. It must have cost you appointments." She set down her teacup, looked at the gown for a moment. "It cost me nothing important," she said. "That's not an answer." She was quiet. The city outside the shuttered windows made its small noises. Then she said, "You came in carrying that dress the way someone carries something they can't put down, but can't keep holding. I recognized the weight of it." A pause. "I've carried something similar." I waited, because I understood that she'd said as much as she was ready to say. "Go home," she said again, but gently. "Take the coat. Bring it back next time." I took the coat, It smelled of cedar and something faintly floral, and I wore it home through the city in the October dark, and I thought about what she'd said about recognizing the weight of something. The next time I came to the boutique, the following Tuesday, I brought her something. It was a small thing, a drawing I'd made in my classroom during a free period, a quick sketch of the view from my window, the school's courtyard with its one stubborn tree that was still holding on to its leaves. I'd framed it cheaply and wrapped it in brown paper, and I felt slightly foolish presenting it as I arrived. But Isolde took it without surprise and unwrapped it carefully, and set it on the edge of the workbench where she could see it. She didn't say anything effusive. She said, "The composition is very clean." Then she went back to work, and I understood that was high praise. I was teaching a color theory lesson to my second graders that week, something about how colors change depending on what's next to them, how the same gray can look warm or cool depending on what you put beside it. I'd been teaching the lesson for 3 years and never thought much about it beyond the pedagogical basics, but that week I thought about it differently. I thought about how Isolde's particular shade of control looked different next to gentleness, how she seemed cooler in the showroom and warmer in the back room, how the same person could be 2 different temperatures depending on the context. I thought about that more than the lesson warranted. There was a morning, 2 weeks into the construction of the new gown, when I arrived at school to find Julian waiting outside. He was standing by my classroom door with his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking exactly as presentable as he always looked. Julian Mercer was one of those people who was always presentable, whose life had never visibly accumulated any mess on the outside. He'd seen me coming from the end of the corridor, and he didn't pretend he hadn't. "Mara." "Julian." I kept walking. He fell into step beside me. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time at that boutique." "Nadine." Of course, she still worked here, though I'd rearranged my schedule to minimize overlap. She would have mentioned it. "The dress needed to be dealt with," I said. "People are saying—" He paused, and I recognized the pause. Julian pausing to choose a framing that would make whatever he was about to say sound reasonable. "People are saying you're spending evenings there, that you're getting quite close with the owner." "My evenings are my own business." "I'm not saying they're not, I just—" Another pause. "Mara, I care about you. I don't want you doing something impulsive or embarrassing. You've had a really difficult time, and I think you should probably be talking to someone, a professional, rather than—" I stopped walking, turned to look at him. He had the grace to stop too. Julian was not a bad-looking man. He had kind eyes when he chose to use them kindly, which was often in public. He'd used them on me for 2 years and I'd believed in them, which was not a failure of intelligence so much as a failure of information. He was using them now, the sympathetic tilt, the concerned expression, the voice pitched at exactly the frequency of someone who wanted very much to be the reasonable party in whatever story was being told about this. "Julian," I said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." I was calmer than I expected to be, standing in the school corridor. Something about the last few weeks, the evenings in the boutique, had shifted some internal arrangement. I am not doing anything impulsive or embarrassing. I am rebuilding a dress and taking it back from a story that hurt me. What I am not doing is consulting you about it, and I'm not going to start. Please don't come to my school again. He opened his mouth. "I'm going to teach children about painting now," I said, and went into my classroom and closed the door. I called Ria at lunch and told her what happened. Ria made a sound that I can only describe as a battle cry of satisfaction. "That's my girl. Did you feel like a main character?" "A little." "Good. Now tell me about Isolde." "I'm at school, Ria." "You're at lunch. You have 17 minutes. Talk." I talked. I told her about the coat and the coffee and the sketch on the workbench and the way Isolde had said I've carried something similar. Ria was uncharacteristically quiet through most of it. "Mara," she said when I finished, "I say this with love and also with absolute certainty. You are falling completely and totally into this woman. We're just, the dress." "The dress," Ria said, in the tone of someone filing a word under evidence. "Okay, enjoy your 17 minutes. I spent the second half of lunch thinking about whether Ria was right, which was probably its own kind of answer. The next evening at the boutique, Isolde gave me a pair of fabric scissors and a piece of practice silk and showed me how to make a clean cut on the bias. It took me 4 tries to get it right, and on the 3rd try, I nicked my finger lightly on the blade and said something sharp. And Isolde came around the table and took my hand and examined the cut with the same focused attention she gave everything, which was so steady and unhurried that I forgot to feel ridiculous about a minor paper cut. "Pressure," she said, handing me a clean cloth. I know. I pressed the cloth to my finger. She was still holding my hand, or rather holding my wrist, and I was very aware of the warmth of her fingers against the inside of my wrist. I'm usually better at cutting things. "You're not bad," she said. "You cut quickly. You trust the scissors. You just haven't learned yet that bias fabric forgives less." She released my wrist, returned to her side of the table. The air in the room continued to function normally, which I appreciated because something in me had briefly gone slightly off balance. "Try again." I tried again. Got it right. She made a small sound of approval that I replayed at least 4 times on the drive home. A week before the gown was finished, Isolde told me she'd been approached about showcasing it. "There's a charity fashion benefit," she said, smoothing the almost complete skirt out along the work table. "Next month, luxury label partnership, auction pieces, a live showcase. A colleague asked me to show something." She looked at me. "I'd like to show this." The dress. The piece. It's no longer a dress in the original sense. She was right about that. What had emerged from the months of construction was something different enough from the original that the relationship between the two was more conceptual than literal. The lines of the new gown were stark and modern, and the lace was incorporated in unexpected places, almost architectural. It was, objectively, striking. I knew this the way I knew when student work surprised me, with a slight recognition, a wordless yes. "I won't show it without your agreement, and I won't show it without you. Without me. It's your piece as much as mine. You were present for the construction. You should be present for the showing." I thought of Julian, standing outside my classroom, worried about what it would look like if I was seen being close to Isolde Crane. I thought of everyone who'd asked me to be graceful, which had always somehow meant being quiet, staying in my lane, not causing trouble. "All right," I said. "Yes." The night before the gala, sitting in her boutique later than we'd sat before, the gown finished on its rack and ready, Isolde told me about the woman she'd loved. She didn't plan it, I could tell. We'd been talking. About the event, about logistics, about whether she had opinions on how I should wear my hair, which she did. Down, she thought. The dress called for it. And then the conversation had drifted, the way late-night conversations drift when there are no more useful things to organize, and she'd said something about why she'd started the boutique. "I was 26, she said. I made a dress for someone." She was looking at the workbench, not at me. Her hands were wrapped around her teacup, very still. Her name was Claire. She was a lawyer. She asked me to design her wedding gown, and I did. And somewhere in the design process, I made the mistake of believing that the gown and what it contained were the same project. A pause. They weren't. She married someone her family approved of, and didn't speak to me after the wedding. I think she was afraid. I think she made the only choice that felt available to her at the time. She was quiet. I understood it, eventually. I didn't forgive it for a long time. I set my own cup down carefully. "Is that why you're cold?" A very slight smile, the first time she'd turned the word back on herself. "Possibly. Or possibly I'm simply introverted and the industry encourages rumors." She looked at me finally. "I built this boutique because I believed that beautiful things should protect women's dreams, not become evidence of their injuries." Her voice was even, controlled. Then I met women whose dreams had been injured regardless, and I learned that the protection I could offer was different from what I'd imagined. Not the dress, something else. "What?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Recognition." We were very still. The boutique was very quiet. The distance between us on that velvet chaise had been narrowing, I realized, over the course of the evening without either of us deciding it. The way things that belong near each other tend to close the space between them when no one's actively preventing it. I watched her face, the careful architecture of her composure, and I thought about what it would be like to be the person who got to see what was underneath it regularly. The woman I'd glimpsed barefoot in her kitchen 2 weeks ago when she'd invited me for tea on a Sunday afternoon, hair loose, wearing a sweater she'd had since university, laughing at something I said about my worst student art disaster, had been so different from Isolde Crane of Atelier Crane that I'd had to stop and look twice. I wanted both of them. I wanted all the versions. She looked away first. "You should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow will be long." "Isolde." She turned back. I don't know exactly what I would have said next. Something honest, I think. Something that would have taken the night apart at its careful seams and let what was inside come through. But she shook her head, one small movement. "Not yet," she said. Her voice was low and perfectly steady. "You're still healing, Mara, and I'm not going to complicate that for you." What if I don't think it would be a complication? What if I'm not sure enough of myself to believe that? She said it simply, without self-pity. It was just true. Give me a little more time. Give yourself a little more time. I sat with that. It was not rejection. I understood that it was not rejection, and yet the space it left felt tender, the way something feels after pressure is released from exactly the right point. "Good night, Isolde," I said. "Good night, Mara." She held the door for me. "Wear your hair down tomorrow." For 2 weeks after that evening, I pulled back. Not consciously, or at least not with any deliberate architecture. I told myself I had papers to grade, lesson plans to write, the ongoing project of sorting through wedding gifts and returning what I could and donating the rest. I did all of those things. I also knew, somewhere under the practical activity of my days, that I was afraid, not of Isolde, never of her, but of the specific vulnerability of wanting something very much that you have not yet been allowed to want. The fear that wanting makes you foolish. I'd wanted Julian's love, and that had turned out to be evidence of something he would later weaponize as naivety. I was afraid that wanting Isolde's love was the same pattern, the same softness, in a place where softness gets punished. Rhea, who could read silence the way other people read text, said, "You're spiraling." "I'm being thoughtful." "You're being afraid and calling it thoughtful." What happened? I told her about that last evening at the boutique, about Isolde saying not yet, about my own hesitation. "Mara," Rhea said, with enormous patience, "Isolde Crane closed her entire boutique for you on the day you met. She made you tea. She offered to remake your wedding dress for free. She asked about your hair the night before a gala. That is not a woman who is uninterested. She also said she's not sure enough of herself, which is what people say when they like someone so much they're terrified of getting it wrong." She paused. "She sounds like someone who's been hurt. You know what that's like." I did know what that was like. "The gala is this week," Rhea said. "Go. Be there. Wear the dress. See what happens when you stop waiting to see if you're allowed to want something." The gala was held in a converted warehouse space on the waterfront. All exposed beams and pendant lighting and long tables set with candles. Luxury garments on display, auction catalogs, the particular music of many well-dressed people pretending to be having an organic evening. Isolde had arranged for the transformed gown to be part of the showcase. Not the auction, she'd been firm about that. Simply shown, displayed, with a brief explanatory text about the design concept that she'd written in the sparse, precise way she wrote everything. I wore the dress. It fit the way a second skin fits, the way something made for you and no one else fits. The ivory silk was warmer in motion than it had looked on the rack. The lace along the bodice caught light in the way it always had, but the cut was different. The asymmetric hem, the modern lines, the deliberate evidence of what it had come from and what it had become. I'd worn my hair down. I'd put on the earrings Rhea had bought me for my birthday 3 years ago, the ones shaped like small leaves. Rhea, who had come to the gala with me, looked at me in the taxi and made a small, strangled sound that I think was meant to be objective. "You look extraordinary," she said finally. "I'm going to pretend to be very busy at the other end of the room, so you can talk to Isolde without me radiating supportive energy too loudly." I found Isolde near the display, speaking in the controlled, minimal way she spoke at professional events, to someone with a catalog and an expression of deep financial interest. She saw me cross the room toward her, and something happened to her composure that I would describe if I were being careful about it, as a temporary structural failure. Not dramatic, just a half second where the control slipped, and underneath it was something very direct and very warm, and then the control reassembled itself and she was elegant and composed again, but I'd seen it. I'd seen it. She excused herself from the catalog person with some smooth transition I barely tracked, and came toward me, and when she reached me, she said nothing for a moment, just looked at me. The dress, the earrings, the hair, the whole composite picture of the evening. "It works," she said finally. "Your design. Your courage." She said it quietly, so only I could hear it. It takes courage to wear something that remembers everything. Julian arrived approximately 40 minutes later. I'd thought he might not come. It wasn't his usual scene. But Nadine was there, which explained it. She was connected to the charity through her family, and Julian went where Nadine went now, which was the shape their relationship had taken in public since the cancellation. They arrived together, and I watched from across the room as Nadine's gaze found the dress display, and then found me, and then found the two facts together. She said something to Julian. He looked at the dress. He looked at me. I'll give him this. He crossed the room instead of avoiding it. That was at least direct. "The dress," he said, stopping a few feet away. He was looking at it in its new form, and I could see him working something out. "The gown," Isolde said, from beside me, and the word landed with a slight distinction I appreciated. "It was redesigned." "Yes, I can see that." Julian's voice had that measured quality, the one calibrated to seem reasonable. "Mara, can we—" "Julian?" I looked at him. I was calm. I found, standing in that room, wearing what had been made from what he'd left behind, that I was genuinely, simply calm. "What would you like to say?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Isolde in a way that had a specific kind of question in it, the kind that was actually a statement about territory and propriety, and the story he'd been telling himself about what I was doing. Nadine had materialized at his elbow. She looked at the gown, then at me, and said, with a lightness that was doing a lot of work, "It's a lot of effort to go to over a canceled wedding." I looked at her. I'd looked at Nadine in staff meetings and at school events for 2 years. I'd thought of her as someone with a quick wit and a competitive streak and a habit of laughing slightly too loudly. I'd trusted her with things. The memory of that trust was its own specific weight. "Yes," I said. "It was a lot of effort. I'm glad I made it." She looked slightly taken aback, as though she'd expected something more defensive. But I wasn't defending anything. I was simply standing here, in this dress that had lived and changed, and I found I had nothing to be defensive about. "The work is beautiful," said someone near the display, a woman in a black gown with a confident air, who turned out to be a journalist for one of the lifestyle publications. She was looking at the descriptive text and then at me, with growing recognition. "Is this your piece?" "It's a collaboration," I said. Ms. Crane designed the transformation. I contributed the original material. The journalist looked at Isolde. "The concept text mentions that the original gown was commissioned for an event that didn't occur. That's a very particular kind of material to work with." "All material comes from somewhere," Isolde said. "The interesting work is deciding what it becomes." I watched Julian's expression across the room move through several stages of something I didn't have the energy to diagnose. Nadine touched his arm and said something quiet. They moved away, toward the bar, toward the far end of the room, away from this particular story. I let them go. The journalist asked more questions. Other people gathered near the display. Someone from the charity organization asked about the piece's availability for the auction catalog, and Isolde declined with such polite finality that the topic simply ceased to exist. Rhea appeared at my elbow at some point and whispered, "You're genuinely the main character right now," with tremendous satisfaction, and then disappeared again. When the event wound down to its final hour of lingering conversations and empty glasses, Isolde and I stood together near the display for the last time before the organizers began collecting the pieces for storage. The room was quieter now, just the remnants of the crowd. "You were right," I said. "I usually am," she said, and the slight arid humor of it made me laugh, and she looked at the sound with that same startled, genuine expression she got when she laughed herself, like she was surprised by the pleasure of it. About the dress becoming honest, I said. It did. I feel it. She turned to look at me fully. In the candlelight, with most of the room gone and the night settled around us, and everything that had passed between us settled too, she looked less composed than I'd ever seen her. Not undone. Isolde Crane was not a person who came undone. I understood that now. She simply occasionally let you see through the surface, but present in a way that cost her something. Real in the way that things are real when they stop being managed. Mira, she said. I know you said not yet, I said. I know you said you needed time and I needed time, and you were right about that. You were absolutely right. I was still bleeding when I walked into your boutique, and it would have been wrong. It would have been the wrong thing for both of us. I'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, about Ria's words and my own fear, and what it means to want something with enough clarity to be sure it's real and not just refuge. But I'm not in the same place I was when I came in. I know the difference between being rescued and being seen. And what you do is see me. You saw me when I was a woman in a lobby holding a dress that didn't belong to her life anymore, and you closed the shop, and you gave me tea, and you made me something honest from the evidence of my own hurt. That's not rescue. I ran out of precision. That's you. She was looking at me with an intensity that was somehow both very still and very charged, like water just before it moves. I'm not healed, I said. I'm not fixed. I don't think that's even the right frame, but I'm real, and I'm here, and I'm asking, a breath. I'm asking if you'll let me stop waiting. She crossed the small remaining distance between us, and she kissed me. It was not tentative. It was not apologetic or exploratory in the way of first kisses that are still deciding whether they should exist. It was a kiss that had been decided, that had the full weight of everything that had come before it, all the evenings and the silk and the late tea and the cashmere coat and the small drawing on the workbench. Her hand was warm at the angle of my jaw, and I felt the breath leave me in a way that had nothing to do with lungs and everything to do with the specific relief of arriving somewhere you'd been traveling toward without knowing the name of the destination. When we separated, she rested her forehead against mine for a moment. Her eyes were closed. I felt her exhale. Not yet, she said quietly. It took me a beat to realize she was quoting herself, the way it had sounded before, the note of postponement. And then she said, "Was the worst thing I said to you." It wasn't the worst, I said. It was the right thing. You were right about the time. I know I was right. Her voice, against my ear, was the quietest I'd ever heard it. I still wish I hadn't had to be. Ria, from somewhere in the middle distance, said, "Oh, thank God," loudly enough that 2 passing waiters turned to look at her. Months have a different texture when you're happy in them. The autumn became winter, and the winter had the quality of something being built rather than something being endured. My apartment stopped feeling like a staging ground for someone else's wedding and became mine. Mara Ellison's apartment, which had a shelf for art books and a window that caught morning light, and a ridiculous cactus that Rhea had given me as a ironic joke about resilience that had turned out to be genuinely resilient. The unopened wedding gifts were dealt with. Some returned, some donated, 2 kept because I actually wanted them, 1 given to Rhea because she'd admired it, and she deserved something good for putting up with 2 years of my romantic miscalculations. Julian and Nadine apparently settled into something or other. Mutual friends reported this with varying degrees of tact. I found that I bore Julian approximately the same goodwill one bears a stubborn cold. Glad it was over. Somewhat surprised it had lasted as long as it did, entirely uninterested in encountering it again. The anger I'd expected to feel more of never quite materialized at the scale I'd braced for. Isolde had theories about this, about how the dress becoming something new had recategorized the entire episode. And those theories were interesting to me in the way most things Isolde said were interesting, which was with a specific quality of attention I was learning to recognize as desire to understand her completely. Isolde, herself, was a continuing revelation. Not in the sense of surprises. She was consistent in the ways that mattered, disciplined and precise and slightly terrifying to people who didn't know her well. But in the sense of depth, there were layers and layers. There was the Isolde who ran Atelier Crane with immovable standards and a reputation for impossible expectations, and the Isolde who had a deep and somewhat embarrassing soft spot for very old films and always watched them with the sound slightly too loud. There was the Isolde who could silence a fitting room with a look, and the Isolde who fell asleep over art books on Sunday mornings, with her hair loose and her reading glasses pushed up on her head. There was the Isolde who wrote the design notes for my gown's exhibition text in a single clean draft without revision, and the Isolde who apologized quietly one evening over dinner for every week she'd watched me fall asleep on that chaise and hadn't done what she wanted to do. Which was? I asked. She looked at me in the way she looked at things she found worth looking at carefully. Stay, she said. I stayed, often. Her townhouse had a quiet that was different from the quiet of the boutique, more personal, less curated, the quiet of a life lived privately and carefully, and with great attention to what mattered. She had plants that were thriving, which told me something. She had books stacked in places that suggested they'd been put down mid-thought and hadn't been moved since, which told me something else. She had a kitchen that smelled wonderful at midnight because she believed that tea was an occasion and not just a beverage. In February, I brought her a new drawing. Not a quick sketch this time, a proper piece, worked up over several weeks. The view from Atelier Crane's back fitting room at the angle I'd always looked at it from the chaise. The gauze curtains, the soft light, the gown on its rack, the original, transformed one, just before its first showing. I'd worked it in graphite and a little watercolor, pale and precise. She held it for a long time without speaking. I like your hands, she said finally. My hands? When you draw. She looked at me over the frame. I watched you drawing in that sketchbook for weeks before I understood what you were doing with the time. A pause. You were drawing my hands. Only twice, I said. More than twice. She set the framing down very carefully. I counted. That was Isolde, precise about what she noticed, quietly keeping track of the things that mattered. Atelier Crane, by spring, had quietly added something to its offerings. It had begun as an experiment, Isolde's idea initially, though she'd built it in conversation with me over those winter months, and by March it had become something the boutique was known for, or becoming known for, among the particular community of women who found out about it through other women. The offering was simple. If you came to Atelier Crane with a dress from a wedding that hadn't happened, for whatever reason, cancellation, loss, grief, change of mind, they would not simply process a return. They would ask what you wanted the dress to become. Transformation, not disposal. I was involved now, which had happened so gradually that by the time I realized I was part of the operation, I'd been part of it for 2 months. I helped with the initial conversations, the ones where women came in holding garment bags the way I'd held mine, carrying the weight of something they needed to put down. I made tea, I sat with people and listened, and asked the questions that might open a direction. Sometimes the answer was that the dress became something else for the same woman. Sometimes it was donated. Sometimes it was turned into artwork, fabric panels, quilts, gifts for daughters or sisters. Isolde made the judgments about what the material could bear. I made judgments about what the person could. You're good at this, Isolde told me one evening as we locked up. It was spring now, and the city was doing that thing it does in spring, the evening light going long and gold and slightly unreal. You're the one doing the actual transformation. You're the one who makes them feel safe enough to tell you what they need. She looked at me levelly. That's the harder skill. We walked to the small restaurant 2 streets over that had become something like our place. Corner table, good wine, long conversations that started with the day's work and went somewhere else entirely. We'd eaten dinner there more times than I'd counted, which I thought meant it was probably a lot. At the table, Isolde ordered wine and considered the menu she'd memorized and said, without preamble, I'm thinking about a rooftop. A rooftop. The building has a roof garden space. I had it assessed last autumn. It's structurally sound, adequate drainage, enough natural light for most of the year. She looked at me. I'd like to use it, not for the boutique itself, for something adjacent to the transformation project. A space where the work can be shown, where we might hold small events. I thought about this. about what it might mean to have a rooftop above Atelier Crane, where the dresses become something else could live in the open air, where the women who'd brought them could see them against the sky. That's beautiful, I said. I'd want your input on the design, the display elements specifically. She set the menu down. Your visual sense is very different from mine. I think the combination would be interesting. Your visual sense, as though it were already established that we were combining things, as though the collaboration were simply a fact to be organized, not a question to be asked. I loved this about her, the way she sometimes just built the future tense into sentences and didn't make a ceremony of it. Yes, I said. Obviously yes. She looked at me over her wine glass. Something in her face was warm in the way it was warm when she was most herself, when the composure wasn't effort but simply ease. You say obviously too much, she said. Nothing is obvious. This is, I said. She considered me, then, very slightly. Perhaps this. The rooftop took through the summer to prepare. We designed it together in the evenings, arguing pleasantly about the display structures. She wanted clean lines, and I wanted something that felt grown rather than built, and we ended up with something that was both, a series of structures that looked like trellises and held fabric, and had roses planted at the base that would eventually climb them. Ria came to see the work in progress in July, and stood in the middle of it with her arms crossed and said, "This is genuinely the most romantic thing I've witnessed," and then looked at Isolde and said, "Well done," in the specific tone she reserved for people who'd earned her respect. Isolde accepted this with a measured nod that was, I knew, extremely moved. On the evening the rooftop garden opened, a small gathering, friends of the boutique, women who'd been through the transformation project, a few people Isolde trusted and I was coming to know. I wore the dress again. Not the original form, not the version that had been shown at the gala. Isolde had worked another quiet transformation over the spring, something she'd done in pieces without quite announcing it, and when she'd shown me what it had become in May, I'd stood in the fitting room and understood that she'd made it into the most beautiful thing I'd ever worn. It was simpler than the gala version. More personal. The ivory silk was softer now, the lace minimal and deliberate, the lines something that could only be described as exactly right. It was a dress for a woman who had been somewhere and come back, who had kept the evidence of the journey and turned it into the evidence of arrival. I stood on the rooftop garden in the early evening light. The city spread out beyond the parapet, the roses beginning their slow progress up the trellises, and I felt something in my chest that I could only call complete. Not finished, completion, in the sense of fullness, of a shape that had its missing element. Isolde came to stand beside me. She was in the deep gray suit she wore for occasions she cared about, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me that first evening at the gala, the look that had broken through her composure for half a second and shown me everything underneath. Only now she wasn't reassembling the composure after. She just let it stay visible. "You're wearing it differently this time," she said. "I'm wearing it as mine," I said. Not as evidence of something that didn't happen, just mine. She was quiet for a moment. Below us, the city made its sounds. The roses were very pale in the evening light. "I'm going to close the shop after the guests leave," she said. I looked at her. "Not because you need protecting." She met my eyes, and her voice was the quiet, certain voice she used when she meant something completely. "Because you're home." I reached for her hand. She took mine, and we stood there in the evening, with the city beneath us, and the dress between us, and everything that had been made and remade, and made honest, spread out across the summer air. And I thought about a woman who had walked into a marble and white rose lobby, carrying something too heavy to hold, and a boutique owner who had understood exactly what the weight was. You close a door for someone in crisis to give them safety. You close a door for someone you love to make a world just for the two of you. The lock turned softly. The sign below, readable from the rooftop if you leaned over, and I did, briefly, just to see it, read closed. And I understood, watching the last of the evening light move across the silk of what had been and what had become, that there was no difference between being protected and being loved when the person doing it was the same. I turned back to Isolde, who was still holding my hand, who was looking at me the way she had always looked at things worth understanding completely. And I thought, This is what honest looks like. Not untouched, not perfect. Honest,